All right. Good morning, everyone, and everyone on Zoom. This is really following up on the tales of, was it cartilage repair and reconstruction? I'm just kidding. We're shifting gears a little bit. So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Mica Estrada, and she'll be discussing leading with kindness. And I had this incredible opportunity to actually hear her speak earlier this year at UCSF's Institute for Diversity, Equity, and Anti-Racism Leadership, which was a 6-month program we had here. And her research was so innovative but inspiring, really examining this act or expression that we all learn about before elementary school, right? Like kindness. So she received her PhD from Harvard in social psychology, and she's the current Dean of Diversity, Inclusion, and Outreach for the School of Nursing. And she's also professor in the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences and the Institute for Health and Aging here at UCSF. And if you do look through her CV and all of her research accomplishments, you can see that it really focuses on something I don't think we think about as much when we have our grand rounds and are talking about other sciences, but really the science of social influence and how looking at identity, values, forgiveness, well-being, and integrative education really has an impact on people and our relationships and how we interact. And she's involved in several longitudinal studies that look at how you can implement and assess certain interventions to improve both retention and recruiting underrepresented minorities to STEM. So all of us who have children know about STEM, and STEM of, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and medical careers is really a field where we've been trying to improve DEI efforts. And her research is funded by both NIH, National Science Foundation, and the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. She's also done some significant work with climate change with a National Science Foundation grant, working with leaders in San Diego to really educate them on how we can make changes in our awareness of climate. And she continues to be involved in that. So I could go on, actually, for a while, but I just want to hand the mic over to Dr. Estrada and just offer a sincere gratitude for joining us this morning. We're really fortunate to have you here. Thank you.
Good morning. I hear this is a late morning for you, but not for me. So I'm still waking up a little bit. I did one of those things where you make your coffee and you leave it on your counter and then you start driving to the place and you don't have your coffee. So thank you for the coffee. All right. I am going to cover, I've been doing research for a while, so I have a lot of research to share with you. And so I'm just going to launch in, and I'll take some questions at the end, but I'm just going to, I talk fast. I'm sorry. It's just kind of the way I am, but you guys are probably used to it. So I want to start with this quote, which is kind of an assumption or kind of a place in which my research builds. It's from this kind of idea. It says, humankind has not woven the web of life. We are but one thread within it. Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves. All things are bound together. All things connect. From Chief Seattle. This idea that we're all interconnected in various ways is something that I was always and have continued to be very interested in. We in this room, looking around, we are connected to each other. I believe that. And we all hold many, many different identities. This is a flower power exercise. I'm not going to do the exercise, but you can think about here at UCSF where your identities may lie. There's many of them. Some of them have influence and power. Others reduce our influence and power. And you can think about which ones of these really don't really matter here at UCSF. But you can place yourself on here and recognize that as we sit in this room, we don't all have the same identities, and we're not all having the same social experience, and we're not all connected in the same ways to each other, although we are connected. There's a way of thinking about how we progress through our professions as going through a pipeline. How many of you have heard the idea that you go through a pipeline through your education? Okay, so I would say it's not a pipeline. I would say more that it's a braided river. And that's increasingly true in this day. People will go in and out of professions. I can't tell you how many friends I have who are medical doctors who end up changing in their 40s and 50s and doing something completely different. I have one friend who went back and got a law degree. So even though you may be set in the direction that you're going in now, you never know what's going to happen. You might stop. we might stop. And people come in and out. And so we have to think about it as kind of this braided river, this people coming in and out and moving and doing different things throughout their lives. For myself, I did a lot of that in and out, and I just want to give a little sense of who I am. I used to do this for a long time ago. I'd always tell a story of who I am before I talk, now they call it positionality. There's a name for it. But all four of my grandparents are from Mexico. And when they immigrated here into the United States in the early 1920s, they worked as farm workers, they were butchers, or they did all kinds of things. The couple down at the bottom there are my grandparents who got married after knowing each other for 2 months, and then he went into the Merchant Marines and helped to really raise me. Because my parents, who were up at the top there, and that's me as a baby, were only 20 and 21 when they had me. The book at the bottom, A Cry of Hope, is a book that my dad wrote about 20 years after I was born that really chronicles his experience with drug addiction and alcoholism, which shaped who I am. The picture with my mom and dad and my first son, Elio, is when I got my doctorate at Harvard. I was pregnant with my second child at that point. And when I finished my degree, I stayed home and I didn't look for a job. I was really worn out from academia, didn't really want to be a part of it. I eventually had a third child, and at the bottom there is my advisor, Herb Kalman, who just died a year ago, who continued to believe in me even though I was at home with my kids and not sure what I wanted to do with my life. Eventually, I made my way back into academia by writing grants and became really active in my writing and found out that by studying social influence, I actually was pretty good at influencing grant writers and the review committees. And so I started to do research again and was able to speak at SACNAS, which is the Society for the Advancement of Chicano and Native American Sciences, which was a highlight for me in my career, and had been doing a lot of work in the National Academies of Sciences. The picture there was with my 3 kids grown up, and you can see time has flown. This is just to say that we all progress in different ways, and you will see that as you move through your careers. And if you have moved through your careers, you probably have seen that there's a story for every single person. So I came back into academia with the science study. I was a PI, co-PI on the study, and we were looking at underrepresented science student program that was funded by the National Institute of Health, and we tracked students across 12 years, or 11 years, longitudinal study. We had a 70% retention rate. That means that at year 11, we still had over 70% of the people responding to our surveys. They were predominantly female, about half African-American, about 40% Hispanic and Latino, and Native American, and then people who were combined of that, mostly in biological sciences and natural sciences. And this was really to see who progresses, and does the program make any difference whatsoever? What I was interested in is how people integrate into their professional careers. I'm always interested in how do we integrate into our community? And this is a theory called the tripartite integration model of social influence. And basically, this is a theory of how we become part of something, of any community. You should think about the community here at UCSF. So one element is, can you do what the group does? Do you feel confident to do what the group does? And if you have confidence, that's called self-efficacy. In this study was, can I do what scientists do? For you, it might be, can I do what a medical doctor or a surgeon does? Science identity is, then do you start to develop a sense of, this is who I am? If somebody asks you, who are you? Do you say, I am this thing? And the third element is, do you start to internalize the values of that community? So when you're highly integrated in a community, you're going to say, I can do what this group does. I am a member of this group, and the values that they have are my values as well. And so the theory is that you would have a positive relationship between all 3 of these and someone who would continue to stay in that group. And in this case, we're talking about staying in a science career. Got it? So that's the basic theory. I'm going to come back to it. So we studied this across time, and what we found was, first of all, they were all related. They're correlated. So if you guys know what correlation is, they're all correlated the way I just said. But then we did what's called a structural equation model, which is to say, what is most uniquely predicting this outcome? And at the time when this was published in 2011, there was a lot of research on efficacy. Like, if you just have confidence in yourself, you're going to be able to make it through this career. But what we found with this study and having kind of the longitudinal piece was that actually, when you look at what's uniquely predicting it, that development of identity and the internalization of values was actually more critical in predicting persistence than the efficacy. Doesn't mean that you don't need to have confidence in doing the thing. You do need that, but that's not enough. You also need to start to have people develop that sense of identity and values. So as educators, if you're an educator in the room, that's one of the things that we start to do. Once you're really integrated into a group, then you start helping other people to develop their efficacy, identity, and values. So we can start to socialize people into our groups through these things. So because it's longitudinal, we could look at what happens 4 years after graduation and what contributes to the development of the efficacy, identity, and values. So we looked at quality mentorship, and we looked at research experience. And research experience, 1 semester and 2 semesters. 1 semester didn't seem to make much difference, but 2 years of experience and research experience predicted the development of scientific identity. And 4 years out, the thing that most uniquely predicted whether people stayed in the STEM field or not was whether or not they had developed that sense of identity of themselves as a scientist. You can see here that it's not related to medical careers. So what we know is that for medical people, your identities are not as scientists so much as clinicians, as doctors, as there's another identity there, but it's not as scientists. That doesn't mean you can't be a scientist, but it's just in this group, we really didn't see that connection. We'd have to have another type of identity, probably medical identity. I also want to emphasize that it wasn't just mentorship. So most people who make it through academia have a really significant mentor, and they think mentorship is really important to have. Like everybody should have a mentor. But if it's not a high quality mentor, we didn't find any, and I had this in multiple studies, having a mentor by itself is not enough because you can have really bad mentors. How many of you had a bad mentor? Yeah, okay, like half the room, right? So the bad mentors don't help us. We have to have a high quality mentor. And if you want to know what that is, they provide psychosocial support, instrumental support, and networking. Psychosocial support is someone who will give you consideration of your feelings. They have empathy. They encourage you to talk openly about perhaps anxieties and fears. They kind of deal with you as a human being. Instrumental support is the kind of support that gives you the concrete tools you need to do the thing that you're doing. And then networking is somebody who connects you to people who are related to your interests and such within the institution, outside the institution. Then there's kind of overall satisfaction. So if you're interested in becoming a good mentor, these are some of the qualities you want to grow in yourself. And if you are a mentor right now, hopefully you're providing these things to your mentees. So what can effective programs tell us about what contributes to persisting? How many of you have heard of the Biology Scholars Program? Any of you? Okay, a few people. So this is a program at UC Berkeley. It's been going on for about 29 years. It's known for being highly effective in increasing persistence for undergraduate students who are kind of high risk for not completing their science degrees. So we knew that it's an effective program. What they brought me in to see is why, what about the program makes it work? So we did, again, kind of a longitudinal study across 18 years. You recognize the efficacy, identity, values. You recognize the structural equation model. And we looked at 2 inputs into this. One was how much were they enthusiastic about the activities that they were in? So in terms of your programs, you can think about what are the things that they do to help build me into, this professional career, and how enthusiastic am I for that? The other thing we looked at was social connection. How much would you miss the people? How often do you spend time with them outside of the program? How much do you like the people that are, how do you feel connected to like the mentors and the advisors? And I think the key thing about this that I want you to pay attention to, so in a structural equation model, you're looking at what uniquely predicts things. So if 2 things are doing the same thing, one of them will end up being 0. But if they're each contributing to something, meaning you need both of them, then they both stay significant. And you can see in here that they both contribute towards science identity and science values. So what does that mean? It means that when you're running programs, if you're doing education, if you're teaching a class, whatever it is, there's 2 components. There's the things you do, and then there's also how do you do it. How you do it matters, and this is evidence of that. And the how is that social connection, and people feel connected to one another. So there's a interesting thing about this is that a lot of programs in training have the same components, but not all training programs have the same outcomes. So the components may be important, but how we work on those components matters. Okay, so what gives elevation? You could talk about like what helps people kind of navigate through, but what gives elevation to this? So recently, about a year and a half ago, I served on a census study for the National Academies of Science, and the census study was on advancing anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM. And these are the committee members. If you're familiar with UCSF, Kamara Jones was here for 2 years doing some work on DIO DEI, sorry, all the acronyms, on diversity, inclusion, outreach stuff. She was also on this committee. And if you're interested in seeing this report, it's online. You can get it for free. And I can make these slides available so you can look it up if you want to. So the arc of the report was to look at kind of the historic context of structural racism, demographic compositions, the ways in which we experience. There was interviews that were done, and then looking at how people who experience racism, what the impacts are, what gatekeepers do and such. I'm not going to go through the whole report, but I want to highlight a few of the recommendations which kind of connect to the research that I am now doing. So how individuals experience racism, one of the recommendations was this: to develop interpersonal environments and institutional norms that promote inclusion, dignity, belonging, and affirmations of kindness. So instead of talking about, I think a lot of times when we're talking about diversity and inclusion, we talk a lot about what we want to get rid of. We want to get rid of bias. We want to get rid of stereotype threat. We want to get rid of prejudice. We want to get rid of discrimination. And it's important that we get rid of those things. But if you get rid of all of those things and you leave nothing in its place, that is not necessarily helpful to anyone. So the other thought is, what do we grow? What do we want more of? And this is really a statement about what do we want more of. We want more people's dignity being responded to. We want more belonging. We want more kindness. So this led me to my research, really. Or my research was kind of informed, I think, this work. We are now stuck. It's not going. Okay. So I've been doing some research on kindness. And the reason I get to this is talking about how people integrate into community. And then the next question people ask is, well, what do we do to help build that? And that led me to the research that I've been doing on kindness. So I want you, for a moment, you probably don't have any pieces of paper here, but I'm going to give you a minute to really think through a time when someone was kind to you in professional life, in your academic career, it may be here. And then I want you to, you can't write. If you're online, you can write because you have paper. Just think about for a minute what happened, how you felt, kind of think about the details of the situation. I'm going to ask you to share this with somebody who's near you if you're in the room in a minute. So take a moment to think about that. I'm going to get my clock. To recall a time when someone was kind to you in your professional life. Okay, so find someone who's near you. I'm not going to make you get up because we don't have that kind of time, but find someone who's near you and tell them about the incident, the time when someone was kind to you. I'm going to give you a minute to do that. If you're online, you can write it in the chat. Okay, if you haven't switch people now. I'll give you one more minute for the second person. I feel like you guys are fast talkers. You're already kind of calming down. Okay, let's come back to me. Okay, so first of all, after talking about a time when you experienced kindness, how does your body feel? How does your body feel thinking about a time when someone was kind to you? None of you are shy. I know that. So, okay. Thoughts? I taught for years, so I can stand in silence forever. Feels good. Okay. Energized. Of lightness.
Yeah, the boost of kind. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's something about when people experience kindness that I think there's a physiological experience, and even just recalling a situation in which you felt kind, there can be a physiological experience. So what was similar about your stories in your dyad? What was similar? Okay. So the person who does the kindness controls resources, has some kind of power, some kind of influence that's different that the other person does not have. That's really common. Yeah. So they have something usually it's something they don't have to do, but they choose to do. That's another characteristic of kind events. There's someone back there. Oh, wow. Yeah. So they can have influence because it stands out, right? So what was different about your stories? Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. So a key thing about this is that if you are already, or many of you are, I mean, most of you are in places in which you have authority and power and influence, the way that you behave and the way that you treat people who may not have the same access to power and influence is going to have an impact. You have more opportunity, actually, to be a kind person and to do things for others that they will remember. And when you don't, they're going to remember that too. So as you are moving through your kind of worlds, you have a lot of influence and a lot of impact on how people are experiencing their learning and work environments and care environments, for that matter. So I did this exercise many, many, many times and started to see lots of patterns, but I wasn't actually studying it systematically. So recently, in 2022, I ran a study on kindness just to get more data instead of being anecdotal. So the way that I define kindness is any act that affirms the dignity of another person. And of course, the next question is, what's dignity? So I drew from a book called Dignity by Donna Hicks, who was actually somebody I worked with and studied with at Harvard many years ago. And we kind of went like this, and then our work came together. And she defines it this way, and we've been measuring it this way. So receiving kindness means you could just imagine what it would feel like to be in an environment where this is happening to you. And I bring it back to the idea of inclusion. Like, to me, a world and an environment or professional conditions in which I feel included, these things are happening for me, right? Felt free to express your authentic self without being negatively judged. Your efforts, thoughtfulness, and your talents are positively recognized. Your feelings, concerns, and experiences were acknowledged as valid. Others conveyed you were included. Others' actions made you feel safe with them. You were treated fairly. Your choices were respected. Others made an effort to understand you. You were given the benefit of the doubt. I want to say that's one of the most common descriptions of what happens in kind of microaggressions, is that you're not given the benefit of the doubt. And then you receive an apology when your dignity felt violated. And then acts of kindness are the same thing. It's just you do it as opposed to receiving it. So I want to differentiate this concept of kindness from altruism and helping. So if somebody does something for you that they're trying to help you and it makes you feel like they just don't trust you, and you feel like they think you're not adequate, you don't feel your dignity is supported, that would not be kindness. Kindness requires the person to feel as if their dignity is affirmed. The same thing is with altruism. So a key component of kindness is that the receiver determines whether or not kindness happened or not, as opposed to the giver. So the intention of the giver might be to be kind, but if the person who's receiving it feels as if their dignity is violated in the process, or doesn't feel affirmed in their dignity, then it's not a kindness. And so we have to check with people to see how it was received. So in this study, you can see that, again, we always have predominantly female, but not completely, and then ethnicity, occupation. I want to point out that for this is mostly people who are in academia, who are professors. You can see 77% work in academia, and they were people who were teaching in STEM, including medicine. And what we found was we looked at well-being, stress, we looked at giving kindness, receiving kindness, and this development of institutional identity, how much people identify with their institutions. And what we found was that people who were receiving kindness were more likely to identify with their institutions. They reported higher well-being and less stress. So this, of course, is correlational. I always put correlation is not causation. We don't know what is causing what in this. We just know that these things are related to each other. So take it with a little grain of salt. But we did do a structural equation model to look at what's the impact of giving kindness as opposed to receiving kindness. What we found is that people who give kindness, that actually does not predict development of institutional identity, reduction in stress, or well-being. But when we looked at receiving kindness, we found that people who report receiving kindness in their professional environments, in their academic professional environments, are more likely to feel a sense of identity with their institution. They're more likely to report lower stress and greater well-being. And those who experience more institutional identity are more likely to report well-being, but not necessarily reduction in stress. So what are the implications for us here? That means that if you're in an environment where you feel like there is none of this affirming of kindness, right, the affirming of dignity, that we're probably going to disengage from our institutions. We're going to feel like we're not connected to them, right? If this place is not a place where I feel personally affirmed in some ways, I'm unlikely to feel like I'm a part of it. And that sense of belonging is going to be lower. And when you do have that, you're more likely to have well-being. And I think it's interesting that the stress is not connected because, as you all know, you can have a high stress environment, but if you have a social environment that's really affirming and kind of holds you, you can navigate that stressful environment. It doesn't mean the stress goes away, but we navigate it better when we have that social support. This is a study that we did on micro-affirmations, and this one was done across time, and this does show that when people experience micro-affirmations, that they're more likely to develop an identity as a scientist. This was done with scientists, and they're more likely to persist. So in terms of relations to persistence, this does show that there is a causal. We can talk about causation in this because of the time element. So it implies that this experience, our social experience, impacts that identity and then persistence. So I mentioned before that when we were talking about the incidence of kindness, that people in leadership positions, that could be a PI, that could be someone who's head of unit, that could be anybody. In the National Academy report, there was a whole chapter on how leaders can advance in their organizations and shift norms, shift values, and shift practices. To the extent that you oversee groups, you have opportunity to do this. And one of the other recommendations they had is to invest in evidence-based programs. And if you're in that kind of position, it's good to show what you're doing has efficacy, that it works. So I'm always saying that at UCSF, that if you're in a place where you're running programs that you know work, collect some data and show that it's really working. Okay, so what are the implications for this? So kindness, it can be this idea that we're treating each other well, but I also think that it really feeds into how our teams work, right? What are the norms that we have and the way that we communicate with each other? Do we do that in a way that's respectful and supports the dignity of other people, or do we do it in a way that's demeaning and violating? Sometimes in academia and sometimes in medical professions. And my sweetheart is a chaplain at San Francisco General, and so I hear a lot of stories about what's happening in the hospitals. Sometimes that's the norm of the unit. Sometimes it's not. So, and that can have a huge impact, as I've been showing. The other element is our organizational levels. What are we rewarding in our institutions? Who's getting promoted? Is it the person who treats everybody like shit and is mean to everyone? Or is it the person who actually is affirming and helping people to really feel connected and to do the work with a sense of compassion and kindness? I think we learn a lot about how to treat patients. We don't necessarily learn about how to treat each other as we're navigating our professional careers, or if we're teaching or training, how to treat each other and our trainees and our colleagues, for that matter. All of that matters. So I want to talk a little bit about a program here at UCSF, the Office of Restorative Justice Practices. How many of you are familiar with this program? Okay. So this program started a couple years ago, and you can see here, their mission is to expand the use of restorative justice practices and applications of a restorative mindset and all the ways we build communities, strengthen relationships, and respond to harm. So this group, this program, they do all kinds of things. So they come in when there's issues, but they also come in when communities are just like a course is starting or a new cohort comes in. At School of Nursing, sometimes they'll come in with the new cohort, and they do this circle where people get to know each other. And they have a framework for establishing norms, which are supposed to be really supportive of people's dignity. And I want to share this with you because it's just an example of how do we do this? This is a way to do this. And one of the things that they did is after running the circles, they had them complete a survey using the kindness study, the measures that I have described beforehand. And what this shows is that for the majority of the people who participate in these circles, they report that every time or almost every time, and some of them sometimes, but very few nevers and very few almost nevers, they're experiencing these elements of affirmation of dignity and kindness in these contexts. So this is an example of a context in which you establish norms in which people are treating each other well. And if you, they'll come anywhere. If you have a group that you want to have better communication and connection, they'll come in and they'll help you establish those kinds of norms and figure out ways to communicate with each other that really support this idea of communicating with kindness, even if it's hard facts. This is another one that they did, and they found, very similar outcomes here. Okay, I've been talking really, really fast, but that's okay. So for a couple of years ago, I was traveling in England, and they have this thing called the New Forest. And the New Forest was this funny place where they had brought in trees from all over the world, and they had one part of the forest that were short trees. And so they had all these different trees, but they were all short. Not necessarily any ecological connection whatsoever. And then they had another area that was tall trees. And I looked at that was just kind of a little bit of bewilderment, I guess, and thinking about just how for many years people thought if you got a tree and you stuck it anywhere, it was a tree and it was going to grow the same as if it was in a tree in a forest. A tree is a tree is a tree is a tree. And I think that this idea that everything is very independent and it grows on its own is a kind of a paradigm of how we do our education as well. Like this idea that people were individuals, and the one who was skilled and had innate intelligence was going to do fine. No matter what context you put them in, they're going to be okay. But we know now that that's actually, it's not true for humans, and it's definitely not true for trees. There's all kinds of things like mycorrhizin, mycelium, roots, and more, so that a tree growing in a forest is having a very, very different experience than a tree growing by itself. There's a book by Rhonda Montgomery called Lessons from Plants, and she talks about how she looks at plants and then uses that to inform how we do mentorship in STEM education. It's a really, really great book. And one of the things I love about it is she really shows how important it is how we connect with one another. So I'm hoping that some of the evidence that I've shared here and the studies I've shown is showing you that how we treat each other actually matters a lot. And it's not just being warm and fuzzy, but it's also, empirically true that we are interconnected and that we impact each other. So I've gone pretty fast, but I can take questions and we can discuss things, and I'm happy to answer questions that you have. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Estrada. That was very interesting and excellent. Any questions, comments? Thought I saw Kelly's hand going up. We'll start with Dr. Worcester.
Thank you so much. That was really excellent. And I was taking a ton of notes, and I have lots of questions, but I'll try not to hog the microphone. Do you have advice or best practices on how to maintain kindness and dignity when you're having a tough conversation or you're delivering difficult feedback?
Yeah. There's a lot that's been done on that. And it's interesting, when I was doing my doctorate at Harvard, I actually was focused on conflict resolution. So I was involved in track 2 diplomacy, mostly between the Israelis and Palestinians. So I was in environments where there was a lot of tough conversations. We also did work in Cyprus, Sri Lanka, Northern Ireland when they were still fighting. And so at that time, I was really focused on how do we have this kind of communication where you don't undermine the dignity of another person in the context of tough conversations. And so there's lots of different ways to do that. But one of the things that helps, I think, is to think about basic needs that we all share. So the classic element is that you have positions, right? So I want this, I want that. And then beneath the positions, we might have interests, the reason why we want that thing. And then beneath that, there might be basic needs. So a classic example would be you have an orange and two people want the orange and they're fighting over the orange. And the position is, I want the orange, I want the orange. And so the classic response would be cut the orange in half and you each get half an orange. So that's the position. And then you ask, well, why did you want the orange? And one of them says, well, I want to make some juice. And the other one says, well, I'm making a cake and I want the rind so I can use the essence for the cake. So now what's the solution? Right, you share, right? One person gets the inside, one person gets the outside. I can see several people doing the hand movements. So there, in that case, the positions actually were not helpful. You needed to know what the interests were. And then if you really wanted to unpack it a lot, like why would you need orange juice or why would you need rinds for cake? The basic need is that we eat and we need food for nutrients, right? So I think that when conversations get tough, it's always good to get out of positions, right? And move to why does this person want that? And that can be really authentic curiosity. Wow, you sound like that was really important to you. That's acknowledging the person's dignity, right? Acknowledging the person that they have a reason, maybe have a good reason for why they want it. And then, why do you? Why is that so important to you? Just asking that question can help with that. And then delivering difficult information, I think, has another element to it, which is to affirm that this person matters to me. So there's a method that we teach, that I teach, is called calling in as opposed to calling out. So somebody does something that's really offensive or bothers you, you can say, you did that, right? But calling in is to say, listen, you really matter to me. Our relationship matters to me. And because of that, I'm going to be honest with you and tell you what you said really landed in a way that kind of hurt me. And I would really like it if you wouldn't do that again. And so I led with the relationship matters and I want the relationship to continue. And the response would be, you really matter to me too. I'm sorry that landed badly and I'm not going to do that again. But that when we have tough conversations, even in a medical setting, the thing that is so uncomfortable about hard conversations is that we risk break in the relationship. And we are completely wired to know that when we have a break in relationship, that person is then potentially unsafe for us. So you can think back for thousands and thousands of years. When you break relationship with someone, that person might become your enemy. They might become somebody who's a threat to you. So we really don't want to do or say anything that can potentially break relationship with somebody. And that's why we don't like to deliver bad news, because if you deliver bad news, they might get angry with us, right? And then they become a threat to us in some way. So the key is to relax that kind of automatic response that this person, that you're going to be a threat to them. So if you lead with anything that affirms that your relationship with them matters, that you care about them, that you don't want, that you're not really trying to be a threat to them, that helps to relax. Like, okay, this conversation, I now have the cue, this person is not going to try to hurt me. in spite of the fact that they have something to say to me that is painful or hard. Does that make sense? So you have to relax that piece, really do that first before you deliver information that is hard. You seem like a really caring person, and I have no desire to harm you. And because I don't want to harm you, I want to make sure you have the truth about what's happening in the situation. That's a very different conversation than, I have some bad news for you. So you're affirming that relationship first. That's always important. And if it's a hard conversation where you're giving bad news or you have a conflict with somebody, always lead with the why this relationship matters first, and I'm not going anywhere. I'm actually telling you this because I want this relationship to be okay. Even if it's someone you're not going to ever see again, you can still do that. Does that make sense? So, and that's why the kindness is important. Those are all, if you look at like those elements, they're all things that you do to let somebody know I am not a threat to you. And when somebody does them to you, your body knows this person's not a threat to me. And that's why when you think about a time when someone was kind to you, often people feel a little calmer. Even if they come into a room and they're kind of upset, they think about someone being kind to them. There's actually like a relief, because in that environment where someone is treating you with kindness, you know you're safe. And that's a very nice place to be. It's a better place for learning. When I work with people who are teaching, and I say, if you're in an ambiguous situation where you don't know it's safe or not, you don't know if people are all for you or not, you are constantly monitoring the room to make sure like this is a safe place. And as a person of color in a room full of white people taking a class, there is a certain level of like vigilance that you are just keeping. I know that. I can't tell you, all through my undergraduate career, I would sit in the back row, and then we would be all people of color in the back row. Why? Because we can see the room. We can see the room. And we didn't do it because we consciously knew that, but it was very, very common to have the back rows. You can see when you teach, go look and see who's in the back of the row. You can see the room. So does that answer the question? Okay, great.
The other thoughts or comments, questions?
I'm going to sneak in another one. You mentioned the term micro affirmations.
Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering if you could give us a couple practical examples of what some very like daily micro affirmations we could incorporate into our interactions.
Yeah. So, a simple one is just smiling, right? Smiling when you walk into a room. I know in medicine, one of the things that's taught is to get at the level of the patient, right? So you're not looking over a person, but you actually go down to them. I think a micro affirmation is knocking and making sure that it's okay to come in the room, asking permission, all those kinds of things that affirm that a person's humanity and dignity is still held. So there's a lot of subtle ways in which we communicate. And it's interesting that I think micro affirmations and also aggressions, a lot of it's nonverbal. So people know that people say something, but if their physiology, their nonverbals are not matching what they're saying, what do you follow? What they say or their nonverbal? Which one is more accurate to you? Nonverbal. Why is it more accurate? Yep, and it's less controllable, right? People are less conscious of their nonverbal, so they leak. And we know that when people leak at the nonverbal, that is more accurate than what they're saying, because people control what they're saying, but they don't necessarily control consciously their nonverbal. So when we see somebody who's giving us mixed messages and we follow the nonverbal. So somebody's saying, "Oh, I'm really happy to see you," and they're kind of like not looking at you. Or if you're on Zoom, if you want to show like nonverbally that you're really paying attention, lift your hands up and put them in the so you just like you're doing something where they can see your hands, because that communicates that you're not typing and doing other things, right? It shows that your hands are present, which means nonverbally you're not doing something else. So you can, so we're looking even in our little rooms, right? In our Zoom rooms, we're looking for the nonverbal cues. And a lot of people don't like the Zoom because they can't see all the nonverbal, right? Because we know that we're looking at that for more accurate information. So, so those are the two things, right? So the micro often will be nonverbal, and you can think about what that looks like. People are relaxed if their shoulders are back. Are they moving their legs? Their legs are crossed and they're doing this. You kind of know that they're not really want to be there maybe, or they're nervous. So yeah, so that's look at the nonverbal, not just the verbal. Yeah.
So, yeah. All right.
Yeah, that's good.
So one of my questions is, has the kindness metric ever been compared alongside things like work hours or ability to do the things that you love? Because I think this is extremely powerful. And I think a lot of the research on resident wellness has to do with kind of focusing on things of like that aren't they're just not as like tangible, or like focusing on metrics that they can, input some sort of change and then see the result. Has there ever been a direct comparison between kindness and some of those other?
Oh, but that's a great next study. The great next study. Yeah. No, I haven't. I mean, I wrote a paper for the Social Issues Policy Review in 2018. I had given a talk, and somebody who was the editor for the journal came up to me after and said, "Could you write that up as an article?" And I said, "Sure." And I thought about it, and I came to them and I said, "Can I write it on kindness in STEM fields?" And he was like, "Sure." So I did all this research to see like what research had been done, and there really was nothing. It's not a term that's been used very much at all, actually, in the research literature. So I did a review of all this literature on it. And this study is the first study I know of that is actually using kindness as separate from empathy or helping. There's books on kindness, but if you look at the literature, it's all on empathy and helping. So there's a lot of room for research. If any of you are researchers, there's lots of room for research. And some of this research has been funded by NIH. So I think it's fundable. But that's great. That's a great idea for the next thing to do. Always looking for research ideas.
You had a great slide up about the kindness in STEM and the kind of points of like recognize people in the room, let them be kind of their authentic personality. And one of the things that I noticed, if you're as somebody who is working with trainees and learners, is this one.
Yeah.
Is in this setting, in medicine, there's a third person, there's the patient. And so I think it's really hard to also let somebody be their like authentic self and let them do their other things, but you're worried about the patient, right? You have to think about that like third party in this, and how do you kind of manage both of them where you're trying to say, I want you to be yourself. I want you to feel free to make mistakes, but it's actually a patient that you're worried about. And so how do you kind of triangulate those?
Yeah, I mean that's always the challenge, right? Because it's not just two people. Often it's not just two people. I think it's more about the norms of engagement, like how do you speak to each other? And I think when you're affirming someone, you're affirming, that not that they're absolutely doing the right thing at that moment, but you're not violating their personhood in the process of saying, listen, that might be doing something that's endangering or harmful to the patient. But that kind of communication can be done in a way that's demeaning, or it can be done in a way that actually is affirming. Like I care about you as this person who's working in this. I know sometimes you don't have time to say those kinds of words, but I think it has to do with how demeaning or how much you're uplifting the person in the process of communicating the thing that you're communicating. It's less about always agreeing or feeling that people are doing what you want them to do at all times, but how do you engage with each other? So you can think about it in terms of meaningful relationships you have outside of work. When you disagree, what is different about that than in the context of work? I've heard horror stories at UCSF of the way people can be treated. I've also heard really beautiful stories of how people are treated, and they're both doing medicine. They're both doing care of patients. They're all, all these stories happen within the context of even ICU units where lots of stuff is happening really fast. So it's, like I said, it's not what you're communicating, it's how is that communication happening? And I think we know the difference, right? Of when we are doing it in a way that's really undermining somebody's sense of being as opposed to not. So it's not what you're saying, it's how you're saying it. That's what we have to disentangle. And that's true in the academic environment, in the training environment, and it's true in the hospital as well. And we work really hard to teach people how to treat patients, but we do much less about how to treat each other. And the burnout levels are very, very high, right, in medicine, and particularly for people who are lower on the totem pole. And so part of that is their treatment, how they're treated. So that hierarchy that we've traditionally had in the hospital is hard on people. So because traditionally when you have a hierarchy, the person who's highest on the hierarchy doesn't have to treat people below them well, with dignity. You can just tell them what to do. You can just, you can demean them. You can do whatever you want to because they're not a threat to your well-being. So learning that actually we're all in a system together and how we treat each other matters. And it doesn't, that's a new, I think we're kind of getting that at UCSF, but it's not true all over the place, especially not in medicine, which has traditionally been very hierarchical. And most people in this room are on top of that hierarchy, to a certain extent. So I think the norm shifting at the doctor level actually will have trickled down all the way down. It's a lot of potential for change. Much harder for someone who's entry-level nurse. So, does that answer the question?
Yeah, no, it's great. It'd be nice to have here's ways to change your tone.
Yeah. I think that the way to do it in medical education is through role plays. I think that's the way. I mean, when I taught conflict management and conflict resolution courses for years to MBA students, and I found that having role plays was really doing a role play and then giving feedback and then role play feedback. That is a really powerful way to learn this type of stuff. And I took a bunch of courses at the law school at Harvard on negotiation, and they used extensive case studies and role play for learning skills like this, and that debrief and then doing another one. And I think that's the way we really learn to get it into our bones, and to learn what works and what doesn't. What are the words that work for me? Because I don't think the same words are going to work for everyone, but that practice I think is really important. So if it's not already in the program, I think that's a nice thing to add, is because I think we do case studies. I mean, in medicine, right? You use case studies a lot for how to deal with different situations, but how do we treat our colleagues and people in our hospital? Maybe that's the next step. Not the patients, but each other.
I had a question. So something that you said was very thought-provoking for me, that kindness is about how it's perceived by the person receiving that act. And then sort of along those lines, we've talked about how to be kind, and we all aspire to be kind, but I think the how is perhaps a little bit, where the devil's in the details. And then when you talked about the conflict between, people from very different groups, that sort of had me thinking about, perhaps culturally competent kindness. Mm-hmm. And I was curious about your thoughts of how we sort of think from the person that we're trying to be kind to, and from their perspective, do you have any tips or tricks on sort of trying to be kind and mindful of the person that you're being kind to, with the goal of, again, them perceiving that you are kind? Because I think sometimes the disconnect is between your intention and
yeah, absolutely. And that's a great point. And I'm sorry, up to this point, I haven't even mentioned that. So I'm really grateful that you brought this up. Yeah, I think it's a huge thing to educate ourselves about different cultures. I think probably get some of that in your education. And if you're at San Francisco General, you would get a lot of that because lots of people. But I'll give an example. Eye contact, right? For some people, direct eye contact is a sign of respect and that you are engaging with them. In some cultures, direct eye contact is really something that is conceived of as kind of impolite and a violation. And so I think as physicians, you're probably learning some cultures want eye contact, some don't. Some want to sit side by side, some want to sit front in front. But it's really, I think, having good communication where you can check, is it okay if I sit here? Is it bothering you? Not making assumptions is really important. And spending time in other cultures and other places that are different from your own culture. regardless of whoever you are, is really important for learning cultural humility, knowing that your culture is not always the right one, and also learning about what other cultures value and think of as kindness. And definitely there's huge cross-cultural differences. So yeah, I think I think cultural humility is really, really important in navigating this, and also being able to just say, the last one is apologize when you violate, being able to apologize and say, gosh, I'm sorry, I didn't understand. And I'm going to do better. I'm going to try and do better going forward. Thank you for educating me, because the next person comes along is going to learn. I'm going to be better because of what you just taught me. So, but I think, I'm sorry I didn't bring that, but yeah, lots of cross-cultural differences, huge ones.
All right. I think we will wrap up there. It's right at 8:30, but Dr. Estrada, thank you again so much for joining us. This was great and really appreciate it.
Thank you. I'll end with this note that my youngest son is pre-med at Penn State, and he wants to be an orthopedic surgeon. He's like so driven, I can't even tell you. But anyway, this is one of the few things I've done that impressed him. So thank you for having me.